The 28th of January, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. Dawn breaks gray and cold over the scarred countryside south of Rome, where frost clings to the shattered olive trees like a mockery of peace. In a stone farmhouse barely standing against the morning, Staff Sergeant John Hawks of the 3rd Infantry Division presses his back against a wall pocked with machine gun fire, listening to the mechanical growl that has become the Wehrmacht's calling card in this stalled invasion. Through a gap in the masonry, he watches them come. 3 Panzer IV medium tanks, their 75mm guns sweeping the landscape, followed by infantry in field gray, moving with the confidence of men who believe armor makes them invincible. Hawks shifts his grip on the weapon in his hands, a 5-foot tube of seamless steel that weighs just 13 pounds, a device so simple it looks like plumbing salvaged from a construction site. The M1 rocket launcher, officially designated, though every GI from Normandy to the Philippines knows it by another name, the Bazooka, christened after a bizarre musical instrument wielded by radio comedian Bob Burns. In this moment, as Panzer treads churn the Italian earth and German voices bark orders across the winter fields, this crude-looking tube represents something revolutionary: the democratization of anti-tank warfare, the moment when a single infantryman could challenge a 30-ton machine built to dominate the battlefield. The shaped charge rocket nestled in the launcher weighs 3.5 pounds. Its copper-lined warhead designed on principles of physics that would have seemed like alchemy to soldiers of the previous war. When Hawks pulls the electrical trigger, a small battery will ignite the rocket motor, sending the projectile downrange at 265 feet per second, while a carefully engineered shaped charge, a cone of explosives surrounding a copper liner, prepares to punch through armor plate using the Monroe effect, a phenomenon discovered in 1888, but only now reaching its terrible potential on the battlefields of a mechanized war. He does not think about the physics in this moment. He thinks about survival. To understand what the bazooka meant, one must first understand the terror it was designed to counter. By 1940, the German Wehrmacht had perfected a doctrine that would reshape warfare: the Blitzkrieg, lightning war, built on the principle of concentrated armor breaking through defensive lines while infantry mopped up behind. Poland fell in 35 days. France, that monument to Western military tradition, collapsed in 6 weeks. The Panzer divisions, from Panzer II light tanks to the formidable Panzer IV, represented a military revolution, and the democracies scrambling to oppose Hitler found themselves confronting a fundamental problem. How does an infantryman, carrying perhaps 50 pounds of equipment, stop a tank? The traditional answer was unsatisfying. Anti-tank rifles, like the British boys' 55 caliber rifle, could penetrate early armor, but these 36-pound monsters were cumbersome, their effectiveness rapidly obsoleted as armor thickness increased. Artillery could destroy tanks, but artillery was rarely in the right place at the right moment. And the fluid nature of mechanized warfare meant that infantry units frequently found themselves isolated, facing armor without support. The Soviets fielded the PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle, effective against light vehicles but increasingly obsolete as German armor evolved. The British had the cumbersome Piat, a spring-powered spigot mortar that worked but required Herculean strength to cock and arm. What infantry needed was something portable, something powerful, something that could be deployed by a single soldier or a 2-man team without extensive training, something that could level the playing field between flesh and steel. They needed a weapon that could deliver a shaped charge warhead capable of defeating thick armor plate, yet light enough for a rifleman to carry into combat alongside his standard equipment. They needed, though they did not yet know it, the bazooka. The story begins in 1940, in the unlikely setting of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where a young Army ordnance officer named Leslie Skinner was wrestling with the problem of how to deliver shaped charge explosives against armor. Shaped charges warheads that focused explosive force through a conical metal liner to create a jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating armor were understood in theory, but the delivery mechanism remained elusive. Shaped charges needed to detonate at a precise distance from their target to achieve maximum penetration, and they were sensitive to spin, meaning they couldn't be fired from rifled barrels without losing effectiveness. Skinner's breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: the work of physicist Robert Goddard, the father of American rocketry, who had experimented with solid-fuel rockets throughout the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds. Rockets were spin-stabilized or fin-stabilized, not rifling-stabilized. They could deliver a payload without the rotational forces that degraded shaped charge performance. Skinner began experimenting with rocket-propelled shaped charges, working alongside engineer Edward Uhl at the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia. The technical challenges were substantial. The rocket motor needed to be powerful enough to reach effective range at least 150 yards, preferably more, yet simple enough for mass production. The warhead needed to detonate reliably on impact without premature detonation from launch, shock, or flight vibrations. Most critically, the launcher itself needed to be portable, durable, and safe for the operator, who would be standing directly behind a rocket motor igniting just inches from his face. Uhl's solution, developed in 1942, was elegant in its simplicity: a smooth-bore steel tube, open at both ends, with an electrical firing mechanism and a simple shoulder stock. The rocket would be loaded from the rear, its fins extending behind the tube's end and ignited by a small battery trigger. The open rear end would vent the rocket's exhaust safely behind the gunner. The revolutionary aspect that separated the bazooka from earlier failed attempts at rocket launchers that had proven dangerous to their operators. It was, in essence, a recoilless rifle, though the mechanism was entirely different from traditional recoilless designs that used countermass or vented propellant. The first test firing took place on a spring day in 1942, with Uhl and Skinner presenting their prototype to skeptical ordnance officers. The weapon was crude. The prototype launcher was literally built from scrap tubing, but when the rocket streaked downrange and punched through a test plate, the observers understood immediately what they were witnessing. Here was a weapon that could be mass-produced for approximately $100 per unit, that required minimal training to operate, and that could give individual soldiers the power to destroy vehicles costing hundreds of thousands of dollars and years to build. By June 1942, the M1 Bazooka was in production. By November, the first units were being shipped to American forces preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The weapon's technical specifications reflected its role as an emergency wartime development. The M1 launcher measured 54 inches long, weighed 13.3 pounds, and fired a 3.4-pound M6A1 rocket, equipped with a shaped charge warhead containing 1.59 pounds of pentolite explosive. The shaped charge utilized a 42-degree copper cone liner that, upon detonation, would collapse into a hypersonic jet capable of penetrating approximately 5 inches of rolled homogeneous armor at optimal standoff distance. Effective range was listed as 300 yards, though practical combat range was closer to 100 to 150 yards, where a reasonably trained soldier could expect to hit a tank-sized target. The rocket traveled at 265 feet per second, slow by artillery standards, but fast enough for short-range engagement. Maximum range was approximately 650 yards, though accuracy degraded rapidly beyond 200 yards. The electrical firing system used 2 flashlight batteries connected to an igniter in the rocket motor's base, a system simple enough that field replacement of batteries became routine maintenance. The 8th of November 1942. The beaches of Morocco and Algeria. American soldiers weighed ashore in Operation Torch, the first major American ground offensive against Axis forces, and among their equipment are the first combat-deployed M1 bazookas. The weapon is so new that many units have never seen it before, let alone trained with it extensively. Field manuals are hastily printed. Rumors circulate about the super weapon that can knock out tanks. The reality of combat proved both validating and humbling. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, when Rommel's Afrika Korps crashed into inexperienced American forces in Tunisia, bazooka teams discovered what their training hadn't fully prepared them for. Engaging a tank requires nerves of steel. The effective range of 100 to 150 yards meant waiting until the Panzer was close enough that its machine guns could cut down the bazooka team. The rocket's relatively slow flight time, nearly a full second to travel 200 yards, meant that moving targets could be extraordinarily difficult to hit. And the thin armor of early German Panzer IIIs and IVs while vulnerable to the bazooka's shaped charge, was often accompanied by screening infantry who could spot and eliminate anti-tank teams. Yet successful engagements proved the weapon's worth. Lieutenant Paul Lehman of the 1st Armored Division recorded knocking out a Panzer III at 60 yards during the retreat from Sidi Bouzid, the shaped-charged jet penetrating the tank's side armor and igniting ammunition inside. The kill was attributed to multiple factors: patient positioning, waiting for the optimal moment, and most critically, hitting the side or rear armor where protection was thinnest. Frontal armor on German tanks was increasingly resistant even to shaped charges, but flanking shots remained devastatingly effective. The weapon evolved rapidly through combat experience. The M1A1 variant, introduced in late 1943, featured improved electrical connectors and a more robust firing mechanism. More significantly, tactical doctrine evolved. Bazooka teams learned to operate in pairs, one gunner, one loader, allowing faster follow-up shots. They learned to position themselves in ambush positions with clear fields of fire and covered escape routes. They learned that patience was survival, that firing too early exposed their position while firing from optimal range under 100 yards meant German crews often never saw their killers. Which returns us to Sergeant John Hawks in that stone farmhouse at Anzio, January 1944. The invasion at Anzio, intended to outflank German defensive positions south of Rome, had instead become a desperate struggle for survival as German forces counterattacked the beachhead with overwhelming force. Allied forces found themselves pinned against the sea, and German armor, Panzer Force, Sturmgeschütz assault guns, even the formidable Tiger I heavy tanks prowled the perimeter, seeking to crush the invasion before it could consolidate. Hawks and his squad had been cut off during a German counterattack, isolated in the farmhouse with limited ammunition and 3 M1A1 bazookas with approximately 20 rockets. The 3 Panzer Force approaching their position represented certain death if allowed to close range. At 300 yards, Hawks rose from cover, settled the launcher tube on his shoulder, while his assistant loader, Private First Class Michael Benedetto, tapped his helmet to signal the rocket was loaded and armed. The electrical trigger was a simple press of a bar beneath the tube. The physics of what happened next unfolded in microseconds. The rocket motor ignited, propelling the M6A1 rocket from the tube at 265 feet per second. The rocket's fins stabilized its flight as it covered the 300 yards in just over 3 seconds, an eternity in combat. Time enough for Hawks to track the rocket's trajectory, for the German tank commander to potentially spot the threat, for everything to go catastrophically wrong. Instead, the rocket struck the Panzer IV's turret at a slight angle, the base detonating fuse triggering the shaped charge. In the nanosecond of detonation, the 1.59 pounds of pentalite explosive collapsed the copper liner into a jet moving at approximately 8,000 meters per second, a stream of molten and semi-molten metal that punched through the Panzer's 50 mm turret armor like tissue paper. The jet penetrated into the tank's interior, fragments ricocheting through the crew compartment, igniting ammunition stores and killing or wounding the crew. The Panzer lurched to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from hatches as the crew bailed out. Over the next 40 minutes, Hawk's position engaged 9 German armored vehicles, 3 Panzer IVs, 2 Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, and 4 SDKF's 251 half-tracks supporting the attack. Not all engagements resulted in kills. Several rockets missed or failed to penetrate, and 2 failed to detonate. But by the time German infantry withdrew from the immediate area, 9 vehicles sat immobilized or burning in the fields around the farmhouse, victims of a weapon the Germans had initially dismissed as ineffective. The engagement became legendary in 3rd Infantry Division lore, though Hawks himself never spoke extensively about it. What mattered was not the individual heroics, but what those 40 minutes represented: the fundamental shift in the balance between infantry and armor. A squad of isolated riflemen, equipped with crude-looking rocket tubes that cost less than a month's salary for a factory worker, had stopped an armored assault that would have required dedicated anti-tank guns or artillery to defeat. The tactical implications were staggering. The Germans, meanwhile, were not standing still. Captured bazookas reached German ordnance experts as early as late 1942, and while initial assessments were dismissive, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reportedly called it a crude tube with indifferent accuracy. The weapon's effectiveness in combat could not be ignored. By 1943, German engineers had developed their own version, the Panzers, or Tank Terror, officially designated Raketenpanzerbuchs 54. The Panzerschreck was essentially a scaled-up bazooka, firing an 88mm rocket with a larger shape-charge warhead capable of penetrating over 6 inches of armor. At 20 pounds and 64 inches long, it was heavier and more cumbersome than the American weapon, but it was also more powerful. The German adoption of American rocket launcher technology represented a rare acknowledgement that, in this specific domain, the Americans had innovated successfully. It was also, ironically, a validation of the bazooka's fundamental design principles. American development continued as well. The M9 bazooka, introduced in mid-1943, represented a significant improvement over the M1. The M9 featured a two-piece tube that could be broken down for easier transport, lengthened to 61 inches for improved accuracy, and equipped with an optical sight for better target acquisition. The M9A1 variant added a more reliable ignition system and improved weatherproofing. By 1944, the improved M6A3 rocket could penetrate up to 4.7 inches of armor at optimal conditions. Though German armor was also evolving, the technical arms race between shape-charge weapons and armor protection accelerated. German tanks began receiving additional armor plating and spaced armor configurations designed to disrupt shape-charge jets before they reached primary armor. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943, featured sloped armor that could deflect bazooka rounds, striking at oblique angles. The Tiger II heavy tank's frontal armor was essentially immune to bazooka fire from the front, requiring flanking shots against thinner side or rear armor. This evolution forced tactical adaptation. Bazooka teams learned to identify weak points, turret rings, engine decks, track links, the thinner lower hull plates. They learned that even if a shot couldn't penetrate, the psychological effect of being engaged with anti-tank weapons could break German infantry-tank cooperation, causing supporting infantry to take cover and tanks to withdraw or button up, reducing their effectiveness. The bazooka became not just a tank killer but a force multiplier, a weapon whose mere presence shaped enemy behavior. The 6th of June, 1944, Normandy, France. In the pre-dawn darkness before H-hour, paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions dropped behind Utah Beach, many carrying disassembled M9 bazookas among their equipment. The weapon has become standard infantry armament, with every rifle company expected to field multiple bazooka teams. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches, bazookas are as integral to American infantry tactics as the M1 Garand rifle or the Browning automatic rifle. The bocage country of Normandy fields, divided by centuries-old hedgerows forming natural fortifications, proved ideal terrain for bazooka ambushes. German armor attempting to navigate narrow lanes found itself vulnerable to short-range fire from concealed positions. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment recorded his battalion destroying 12 German vehicles in a single week using bazookas, often engaging at ranges under 50 yards where the weapon's accuracy was maximized, and German crews had minimal time to react. The statistical record is staggering. By the end of 1944, U.S. Army ground forces had received approximately 350,000 M1 and M9 bazookas. By war's end in May 1945, production exceeded 476,000 units, with an estimated 15 million rockets manufactured. This represented an extraordinary industrial commitment to a weapon that had existed only on paper 3 years earlier. For comparison, the U.S. produced approximately 1.5 million M1 Garand rifles during the war. The bazooka production run represented 1/3 of that figure, for a weapon serving a far more specialized role. The cost-effectiveness was remarkable. At approximately $100 per launcher and $15 per rocket, a bazooka team could engage vehicles costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. A Panzer IV cost roughly 103,000 Reichsmarks to produce by 1944, equivalent to perhaps $200,000 in contemporary American dollars, when accounting for purchasing power. A Tiger I cost over 300,000 Reichsmarks. The asymmetry was profound. A $100 tool could neutralize a weapons platform representing massive industrial investment and resources, increasingly scarce for Germany's war economy. While the bazooka was designed specifically as an anti-tank weapon, the Pacific theater revealed unexpected versatility. Japanese armor, primarily light tanks like the Type 95 Ha-Go and Type 97 Chi-Ha, was thinly armored compared to German vehicles, making bazookas devastatingly effective against them. But American Marines and soldiers discovered the weapon's utility extended far beyond anti-tank roles. On Saipan in June 1944, bazooka teams employed the weapon against Japanese fortifications, using the shaped charge warhead to blast through concrete bunkers and cave entrances that would have required satchel charges or flamethrowers to reduce. The psychological impact was substantial. Japanese defenders, accustomed to weathering artillery and small arms fire, found themselves vulnerable to precision fire from individual soldiers. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Marines used bazookas to engage pillboxes at ranges under 50 yards, the shaped charge blowing man-sized holes through reinforced positions. Technical limitations were sometimes improvised away. The M6 rocket's shaped charge jet was optimized for armor penetration, not blast effect against personnel or structures, but troops discovered that firing rockets into cave mouths or bunker openings created devastating overpressure effects in confined spaces. Field modifications appeared. Some units removed the copper liner from rockets to enhance fragmentation and blast effects when engaging soft targets, though such modifications were officially discouraged as potentially dangerous to operators. Private First Class Harold Schultz, photographed helping raise the flag on Mount Suribachi, had served as a bazooka gunner during the early days of the Iwo Jima assault. His squad used their launcher to knock out a Japanese Type 97 tank at close range and subsequently employed it against multiple pillboxes. The weapon's versatility embodied the improvisation that characterized Pacific combat, where American forces adapted weapons designed for European warfare to the challenges of island fighting. To carry a bazooka in combat was to accept a peculiar burden. The weapon made you a priority target. German and Japanese troops learned quickly to identify and eliminate bazooka teams before they could fire. The gunner carried a 13-pound tube that was awkward to manage in thick terrain, while the assistant carried rockets that were fragile despite their lethal purpose. A two-man bazooka team typically carried 4 to 6 rockets, each mission potentially representing a brief, intense engagement followed by withdrawal or death. Training emphasized fundamentals. At infantry training camps across the United States, recruits learned to estimate range critical given the rocket's arcing trajectory and limited accuracy beyond 150 yards. They practiced loading drills until they could arm and fire in under 10 seconds. They learned to lead moving targets, accounting for the rocket's relatively slow flight. Most critically, they learned crew communication, the loader's responsibility to ensure proper seating of the rocket, to clear the danger zone behind the launcher, to tap the gunner's helmet when ready to fire. The psychological dimension was substantial. Engaging a tank with a bazooka required suppressing the human instinct to flee from a 20-ton vehicle equipped with cannon and machine guns. Veterans speak of the peculiar terror of waiting for a Panzer to enter optimal range, knowing that firing too soon meant possible escape, but firing too late meant exposure to devastating return fire. The moment of trigger pressed the whoosh of the rocket motor igniting, the flash of exhaust, the smoke trail pointing directly back to your position, was the moment when concealment ended and survival became chance. Technical limitations were never far from consciousness. The electrical firing system could fail in wet conditions. Moisture could short the connections, leaving gunners with a loaded launcher that refused to fire. Batteries died, often at critical moments. Rockets occasionally failed to ignite, leaving gunners performing emergency unloading procedures under fire. The weapon's backblast, the jet of rocket exhaust venting behind the launcher, could ignite grass or foliage, revealing positions through flames and smoke. Firing from enclosed spaces like rooms or trenches could concuss or even kill the operator if insufficient ventilation existed for the exhaust. Yet when it worked, when the rocket flew true and the shaped charge detonated precisely against armor, the effect was transformative. Corporal James Arness, later famous as Marshal Matt Dillon in the television series Times Gunsmoke Asterisk, served as a rifleman at Anzio and recalled watching a bazooka team knock out a German assault gun. The rocket hit, and this massive machine just stopped. The crew piled out, and they were running. And we were just infantrymen, but we'd stopped this thing that had been killing us. That was the bazooka. It gave us a chance. For all its revolutionary impact, the bazooka was never a panacea. Its limitations shaped tactics as much as its capabilities. The 300-yard maximum effective range meant that German tanks equipped with high-velocity 75mm or 88mm guns could engage bazooka teams from distances where return fire was impossible. Late-war German armor, Panthers, Tigers, King Tigers, featured frontal armor that could resist bazooka strikes, requiring flanking maneuvers or shots against weaker points. The weapon's accuracy degraded rapidly in wind or rain, and the unguided rocket could not reliably hit moving targets beyond 100 yards. Infantry anti-tank doctrine evolved to incorporate these limitations. Bazooka teams were taught to establish ambush positions with multiple angles of fire, allowing engagement of vehicles from side or rear aspects even if frontal attack was impractical. They worked in coordination with mines, obstacles, and other anti-tank weapons to create kill zones rather than relying on individual engagements. The bazooka became part of a system rather than a standalone solution. German countermeasures evolved as well. Tank crews learned to scan for telltale smoke trails, to suppress suspected bazooka positions with machine gun fire, to avoid narrow lanes and choke points where ambushes were likely. Infantry screening became more sophisticated, with German riflemen tasked specifically with hunting bazooka teams. Spaced armor and Schürzen armored skirts protecting the tracks and lower hull became standard on German vehicles, specifically to defeat shaped charge weapons. The technical arms race continued beyond the war's end. The German Panzerfaust, a single-shot, disposable anti-tank weapon, represented a different evolutionary path, trading reusability for simplicity and mass production. The Panzerfaust could be produced for a fraction of the bazooka's cost and required minimal training, though its 30 to 60-meter range was considerably shorter. Post-war analysts debated which approach was superior. The answer, as usual, depended on tactical circumstances. What was undeniable was that the bazooka had fundamentally altered the calculus of armored warfare. No longer could tank commanders assume infantry were helpless against armor. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. Armor became vulnerable, its dominance no longer absolute. This forced changes in German tactics, pulling armor back from direct infantry engagement and altering the fundamental relationship between tanks and infantry that had defined blitzkrieg warfare. The war ended on the 8th of May 1945 in Europe and the 15th of August 1945 in the Pacific. When German officers signed surrender documents, and when Japanese representatives stood on the deck of the USS Missouri Times to end the war, among the weapons stacked in defeated arsenals and still carried by occupying American forces were tens of thousands of M9 bazookas. The crude tube that Wehrmacht officers had dismissed as a fireworks launcher had helped break the back of German armored forces and proved adaptable enough to serve in the jungles and islands of the Pacific. The bazooka's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The weapon established the template for infantry anti-tank systems that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. The Korean War saw extensive bazooka use against North Korean and Chinese armor, though limitations against the Soviet T-34 led to the development of the improved 3.5-inch Super Bazooka in 1950. Vietnam saw continued use of rocket launchers, though often adapted for bunker busting and fire support roles. The fundamental concept, shoulder-fired rocket launcher with shaped charge warhead, evolved into weapons like the M72 Law, the Swedish Carl Gustaf, the Soviet RPG-7, and eventually guided systems like the FGM-148 Javelin. Every modern infantryman carrying an anti-tank weapon inherits the legacy of Leslie Skinner and Edward Uhl's wartime innovation. The RPG-7, perhaps the most widely distributed weapon in modern history with over 9 million produced, is a direct descendant of the bazooka concept. The Syrian Civil War, the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the current war in Ukraine all feature infantry anti-tank weapons that trace their conceptual lineage to that first crude prototype tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1942. The strategic implications rippled through military theory. The bazooka demonstrated that technological superiority in armor could be challenged by comparatively simple infantry weapons, a lesson that would resonate through subsequent conflicts. The weapon embodied American industrial philosophy: pragmatic, mass-producible, good enough to solve the immediate problem without requiring perfection. At $100 per unit, the bazooka represented a force multiplier that allowed citizen soldiers, draftees, and volunteers who months before had been farmers, mechanics, and clerks to engage and defeat sophisticated military machinery operated by professional soldiers. Sergeant John Hawks survived the war, returning to his home in Omaha, Nebraska, where he worked as a plumber for 43 years. He rarely spoke of Anzio, deflecting questions from his children about his service with the quiet humility common among his generation. When pressed, he would say only that he did what needed doing, that the bazooka was a good weapon, and that he was lucky to come home when so many didn't. The farmhouse where Hawks made his stand was demolished in the 1960 seconds during agricultural modernization. No plaque marks the site. No monument commemorates the engagement. The fields where 9 German vehicles burned have long since been replanted, harvested season after season by farmers who may not know what happened there in January 1944. Such is the nature of war. The ground forgets, even when history should remember. What remains is the legacy of innovation born from necessity, of engineering solving tactical problems, of a weapon that gave individual soldiers the power to challenge armored warfare's dominance. The M1 bazooka was never elegant, never sophisticated by the standards of military technology. It was a steel tube with a battery trigger, firing a fin-stabilized rocket with a shaped charge warhead, effective to perhaps 150 yards on a good day with a steady hand and strong nerves. But on the beaches of Anzio and in the bocage of Normandy, in the jungles of the Philippines and the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, that crude tube represented something profound. The moment when infantry regained agency in a war dominated by machines, when a soldier with a $100 weapon could challenge a $100,000 tank, when warfare's calculus shifted and armor discovered it was no longer invincible. The bazooka was never Hitler's worst nightmare in the dramatic sense. That distinction belongs to the Soviet T-34, to Allied air superiority, to the industrial might arrayed against the Reich. But for German tank commanders, hearing the whoosh of an igniting rocket motor and knowing a shaped charge warhead was arcing toward their vehicle, for infantry pinned down by a Panzers machine guns watching their bazooka team maneuver into position, the weapon represented something undeniable: the power of innovation, the courage of soldiers, and the stubborn refusal of free people to accept that might makes right. In the end, that may be the bazooka's truest legacy, not the technical specifications or production figures, but the principle it embodied. That in warfare, as in freedom, the individual matters, that technology can be democratized, and that courage combined with the right tool can change the outcome of battles, wars, and history itself. The tube that changed war was, in the final analysis, exactly what it appeared to be: simple, effective, and in the hands of soldiers like John Hawks at Anzio, absolutely revolutionary.